rendezvous is past those hills in the distance. Just mind that village down there.
All right, lads. Hang on. Here we go.
Left flank. Capture tanks moving into the village.
Steady, lads. We're well behind Jerry's lines now. No way of knowing what we're up against.
That's a cheerful thought. Come on, lads. We've held together this long. Let's not fall apart now.
Old Bess has got us this far. And she'll get us all the way if we do our bit.
Hello, Warfighters. War is Hell. Welcome to the next episode in the Battlefield 1 campaign, where rather than doing commentary on the actual gameplay, I'm going to be talking about World War I through this and how it pertains to what you're watching in this part of the campaign. So, the way that the Battlefield 1 campaign is broken up, though, is there are multiple stories that you kind of follow throughout. And so, this is the last episode that focuses on a tank crew, so we won't be diving into Armor nearly as much as we have in these last few episodes. But I wanted to end up this last part by telling one of the coolest stories that I was able to find in World War I, and it was about a tank crew. I did a lot of research to try and find what I thought was the coolest story. I even watched an interesting documentary that was made by the BBC called Our War. The third episode, they follow a tank crew throughout the entire thing, and don't get me wrong, it was very powerful and very moving, but I found a really cool story that I wanted to share, just reading through articles about World War I tanks. And it's kind of got a cool story on how we know about this, because it wasn't until later on that a family history or genealogical site, findmypast.co.uk, was able to put this story together. Like, they found information, newspaper articles, be able to provide the story, which is really cool, but it's also kind of sad at the same time, because you know, one of the things that make me enjoy studying military history is these profound, inspiring stories. And it just is sad that not everybody gets a chance to have their story told for one reason or another. I mean, I'd like to be able to hear as many veteran stories as I possibly can, but that's for another episode. All right, so this is the story of a Mark IV tank called the Fray Bentos. Now, Fray Bentos is like a meat company too, but the captain of the tank was actually a grocer, and I think that's where they got the name from. But anyway, so the Fray Bentos took part in the Battle of Passchendaele, which, when I was doing some research on this, it mentioned the Battle of Passchendaele as being remembered for the notoriously muddy conditions, is the way that they worded it, which I thought that was pretty interesting, because I'm like, it's World War I. There's mud everywhere. I mean, you think about no man's land in trenches, and there's obviously mud. But I had to go do some research because, yeah, that really intrigued me. And so it's 1917. Okay, so constant shelling had churned the soil, and the soil around there was basically clay. And not only did it mix up all of the clay soil, but it also had damaged and destroyed a lot of drainage systems. So, one, you've got a lot of water just from the damage to the drainage systems. And then there were heavy rains, which coincided with the opening assault on July 31st of 1917, which produced even more mud. And so because it was like a clay mud, it obviously like caked uniforms and it clogged rifles. But what was crazy to think is that the mud became so deep that in a lot of places, pack mules, horses, and even men drowned in the mud. I can't think of too many more worse ways to die than drowning in mud. But that's just how bad it was. And there was actually a lot of debate, too, on whether or not the Battle of Passchendaele should have continued as long as it did, because obviously if you've got a lot of mud, it's very difficult for the attackers to advance, and it's almost like a force multiplier for the defenders. But anyway, back to the Fray Bentos. Okay, so it was crewed by 9 individuals. Captain Richardson was the officer in charge. Second Lieutenant Hill, Sergeant Misson, Lance Corporal Binley, Private True, Private Arthurs, Private Budd, Private Maury, and Private Brady. All right, you're probably not going to remember those names. I don't blame you, but I just feel it's respectful to make sure that I mention everybody's names that I can. Okay, so it's August 22nd, 1917, again, Battle of Passchendaele. So the Fray Bentos was responsible for leading an attack with 7 other British tanks, and their target was on the German side, obviously, And there was a series of farm buildings like barns and all that stuff, which had been heavily fortified by the Germans. And so they start their attack, and very early on, 7 of the tanks end up either becoming bogged down in this mud that I was telling you about, or they were destroyed. Now, there's 8 total. 7 of them get taken out early, so you can imagine that the only tank here that's still continuing on the fight is the Frey Bentos. Now, the Frey Bentos was able to get to one of the strong points that they were tasked with taking out. Not a big surprise, you know, this is exactly what tanks were made for and what they excelled at. But as they were engaging this one strong point, German machine gun fire ended up hitting the tank near the driver's half-closed visor. Now, a bullet ended up going through the visor, and it injured both of the officers that were on board, which was Captain Richardson and Second Lieutenant Hill. Now, Second Lieutenant Hill was driving the tank when he was struck, and so he ended up falling over. He hit the throttle as he was falling over, and that caused the tank to just go straight into a crater where it became stuck. I mean, these tanks were obviously big, 30 tons, had a 105 horsepower engine. All right, so it was going to be very difficult for them to get out. Now, on the top of every tank, in a situation where it would become stuck in mud, there was a wooden beam, and you can kind of see it once I stop killing these guys. But at the very top of the tank, you'll find a beam, and the whole purpose of it was for it to be thrown out up front to allow the tracks to get some traction on something and to be able to get moving. See, there's that wooden beam. All right, so Private Brady volunteered to go out and unleash the beam. But a German position saw him get out of the tank, and they opened fire on him and ended up killing Private Brady. Private True, who was, again, another crewman, volunteered to get out of the tank to try and get to Brady and then also help with the beam. But Captain Richardson wasn't going to allow him to get out of the tank after what had just happened to Private Brady. And so they're all stuck in the tank, and the siege of the Frey Bentos, as it's called, starts at this point. Now, the Germans obviously knew that the Frey Bentos was stuck, and so they started firing artillery and mortars just all around the tank. And because of that, and other things, like injuries continued inside of the tank. So Private Arthurs, for example, was hit by shell splinters. The other gunner of the tank, Private Bud, he got wounded in a pretty nasty way. So they were trying to restart the tank and get it moving, but as they were doing that, it ended up slipping and falling over just a little bit more. And then when it tipped over, the movement of the tank made one of the guns on the side stick into the ground outside, and that end part of the gun swung and it hit him in the ribs, like crushing Private Arthur's ribs. That sucks. But, you know, after artillery and mortar kind of took a little bit of a break, there was a lull, and the crew tried to make another attempt to get outside of the tank, or at least to try and free it. But they had figured out that Private Brady's body and the heavy beam that he was trying to get to had fallen and was blocking the main door. So that trapped the crew inside. And inside the tank, it was getting pretty hot, like 30 degrees Celsius. Now, it kind of goes without saying that working in these tanks was absolutely terrible. A lot of times, tank crews would fight for 1 to 2 days, and even though none of them were wounded by, gunfire, artillery, anything like that, they would still all be hospitalized because of the fumes and the terrible environment that they had to withstand inside of the tank. So things were getting pretty bad. But the one good thing, though, is the way that the tank was inside of the crater, it made it very difficult for the Germans to be able to get a number of hits on the tank. They'd still be able to, get a pot shot in now and then, but nothing that would cause catastrophic damage to the tank. So, with all of this going on, the crew of the Frey Bentos, remember, they're inside. They were able to take the fight to some of the Germans, though, using one of their machine guns to break up 2 counterattacks that were being drawn up on the main British position. So even though that they were stuck and everything, they were still in the fight. Now, Captain Richardson knew that eventually that the British were going to launch artillery of their own on the tank because they didn't want the tank to fall into German hands. I mean, it was one of the greatest advantages that the British had during the war, that they had tanks and the Germans really didn't. Remember, from one of the first episodes, we learned that the Germans only produced 20 tanks throughout the entire war, so capturing these tanks were of vital importance to the Germans. Okay, so night comes, and Sergeant Misson volunteered to go all the way back to British lines to make sure that the British knew that the tank still had crew members alive in there, because they would hold back from shelling the tank if they knew that there were people still alive. But the battle was still being fought, and Richardson wanted to stay in no man's land in order to cause the enemy some problems. If they were going to be getting to the tanks, he wanted to make sure that, you know, they were putting up a fight. But that night, the Germans did attack, and Private Maury were the ones who first noticed them, and he started opening fire on them with one of the machine guns. And one German was able to get to the tank, open the door, and almost threw a hand grenade into it, into the tank, which would have obviously killed everybody, but he was shot pretty quick by Captain Richardson. So there were still a number of other attempts to try and blow up the tank with explosives. The Germans were able to get pretty close to it. But again, the British inside the tank were able to just fight off the Germans with small arms fire and everything that they had. But as time progressed, it was still getting worse and worse inside of the tank. Private Budd ended up dying of his injuries, and Lance Corporal Binley had part of his scalp removed by a shell splinter. So things aren't going completely great at all for those who are inside of the tank. All right. Now, at this point, though, the water was running out. They had to start drinking water from the tank's radiator. And Richardson, though being a good officer that he was, kept doing what he could to keep the morale up for everybody in there. So he would convince his men that they were doing more damage to the enemy than they were doing to him. And in some respects, it was true. And so they saw a third German counterattack, you know, forming up on the main British positions. But this time, they weren't able to bring their machine gun. And so they tried to hit Germans with the rifle that they have, and that caused some of the groups of the Germans to scatter. Now, their intervention in the battle did bring a fresh round, of course, of machine gun and mortar fire back on the tank. And after nightfall, another assault on the tank by the Germans began, because they knew that this tank just being out there was doing some damage, of course, to the Germans trying to counterattack on the British. So at this point, the crew of the Fray Bentos, they see men approach from the direction of the British lines. But when you're out in the middle of no man's land like them, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're good guys. But those who were at the British lines ended up firing a flare, which showed the men in the Fray Bentos that the guys who were 20 yards away were in fact German. And so machine gun fire from the British positions drive off that attack. And from that point, the British know, like, they've got to keep up sending flares to make sure that the Germans can't sneak around like that. And it ends up working. So now we're on day number 3, and the crew of the Fray Bentos is still getting injured. Private True's face was slashed by shrapnel when he tried to look outside of the tank. Private Maury was uninjured. He was the only one at this point who hadn't been wounded in one way or another, or even killed, like 2 other members of the Fray Bentos had been up to this point. Rations were getting low. Remember, they're drinking out of the radiator of the tank. Ammunition for their revolvers, their rifle, the machine guns on the tank were running low too. And remember, this is 72 hours that these guys were going on, so they were also exhausted. So Richardson and Hill, the 2 officers, get together and they decide that the crew of the Fray Bentos should just try and make a break for it and escape. And so after the sun went down on the 3rd night, everybody who was still alive inside of the tank were able to slip out and get back to the lines. Now, the Germans made no attempt to stop them, and it doesn't say whether it was because the Germans didn't notice or, you know, the Germans didn't open fire on them out of choice, but anybody who was still alive made it back safely to their own lines. And so the 72-hour siege of the Fray Bentos was done and over with. Now, what was also cool is not only did they get back to their lines, but there was also a standing order that all the British had, which was to make sure that the machine guns on their tank weren't captured either. And so they made it back to their lines, and they even brought their machine guns with them, which was pretty cool. Now, there's more to this story, too. Like, the Fray Bentos crew received more decorations than any other tank crew in World War I. Richardson and Hill were awarded the Military Cross, as well as everybody else receiving other decorations in the crew as well. Captain Richardson ended up fighting again in the Battle of Cambrai in a tank that he called the Fray Bentos II, which I thought that was pretty cool. What sucks, though, is that tank was put out of action during that battle and was captured by the Germans. They took it to Berlin and they put it on display. In fact, you can actually do a search and you can find that picture of the Fray Bentos II. Definitely beat up, stripped of all of its weapons, but it's cool to be able to see a picture of that. Captain Richardson's son, too, after this war, ended up joining the Royal Tank Regiment in the Second World War. However, he was killed at the Battle of El Alamein. So this story of the Fray Bentos, I thought was just really amazing. Holding your position for 72 hours in the face of 3 German counter-assaults, too. And the British, helping them and everything by launching the flares and whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of cool stories that were out there. There's a lot of respect that, I have for the tank crew members in World War I, because even though we think of tanks, being as this crammed, place where you have no space, all this fire going on around you, in many ways, the conditions are far better than what they faced in the First World War. And it's very interesting, too, as we kind of wrap up this series. I never understood exactly how one-sided that World War I was when it came to tanks, how little that the Germans had. But what's interesting is, of course, once we get to the Second World War, not having many tanks is not a mistake that the Germans ever made again. Definitely revolutionary. Anything that we're still using today that was invented 100 years old, I guess you could say, all of that is revolutionary. But I think it just goes to show how innovation and adopting new weapons and bringing them to the field can really make a difference. So this has actually been a really, really cool series to be able to do, to kind of learn more about the tanks, and hopefully you guys learned a little bit more as well. So in the next set of videos, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about aircraft, which will be great for me because I love aircraft. But that's going to be it here for this episode. Thank you for watching. I sure do appreciate it. Feel free to subscribe if you have not already. You can follow me on Twitter @_WarIsHell or on Facebook. Just search War is Hell Gaming and you'll find me there. But thanks again for watching. War is hell, but you don't have to worry because warfighters, I've got your 6.
So, what do we do now, driver?
We walk.